How words are pronounced and used depends on context, but traditional learning materials lack the diversity to prepare you for real-world Chinese. Fortunately, YouGlish is a great tool for studying language in context. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to introduce a tool which is excellent for looking up how words are pronounced in Mandarin and also see how they are used and said in context. The tool in question is called YouGlish, and it is essentially a service that allows you to access clips from YouTube based on words you search for. So the way it works is that you input a word and it then searches all the transcripts on YouTube for that word and then presents them to you in a very easy to access manner. If you were to search for a very common word like how, you will get hundreds of thousands of hits, but even if you search for rarer words and expressions, it's likely that you will find at least a few hits, because there is a lot of content on YouTube. The point here is that the interface then allows you to browse through these clips simply by listening to the specific snippet where this word appears. So if you search for how, you will then hear somebody say how inside of a sentence. You can then click next, hear how in the next sentence, click next, and then listen to how in context as many times as you want. The interface also has some other nifty functions. You can play the same clip again, you can change the playback speed, you also have transcripts with pinyin and the Chinese characters, and there are a few other useful tools that you can use. But the main point is that it allows you to browse through clips focusing on a specific piece of vocabulary. YouGlish is free to use and you can access it at youglish.com, so that's you as in you and me, and glish as the end of English, which is where the name comes from, but like I said, it is available in many other languages, including Chinese. You can also choose regions, so you can focus only on, say, Taiwan, mainland China, Singapore, or Hong Kong. So there are other options you can explore if you like. In this episode, I want to talk about why this tool is so useful and how you can incorporate it in your overall approach to learning Mandarin. One of the most challenging aspects of learning Chinese is that things rarely appear the same in context as they do in isolation. So you might study a word in your textbook, but then when somebody says it in real life, they don't really pronounce it the same way, or when it appears in a sentence, it sounds different. Words in Chinese are rarely used the way the English translation in your textbook might indicate, so figuring out what something means is one thing, but then figuring out what it means in context and how it is used is another. YouGlish is a really good tool for showing you Mandarin in context, and here we're then going to focus on the two areas that I just mentioned. So the first one is pronunciation in context, and the other one is language usage, so a word, how it works inside of a sentence, or how it acts together with other words. First, let's talk about pronunciation. And here I think YouGlish is very useful because it provides you with a wide range of native speakers saying the same thing. Pure beginners might benefit from not having too much variation in the Chinese they're listening to before they get used to the basics, but most students benefit from hearing things said by different people. This is how we figure out what is unique to the way this tone sounds or this word sounds, as opposed to what is characteristic for a specific person to say it, such as your teacher if you're listening only to one person. So in essence, YouGlish works like a pronunciation dictionary here. You input a word you want to hear people say, and you can then quickly skip between different clips on YouTube and hear how people actually say it in real life. There are many other reasons why this is useful, and one of them is that sounds and tones don't sound the same in context as they do in isolation. For example, the third tone is usually taught as a dipping tone, so how, in isolation, but nobody says how inside of a sentence. Instead, it changes to a low tone in front of anything but another third tone, and when there's a third tone coming after it, it changes into a rising tone, as in ni hao. If you're not sure about the tone change rules for the third tone, check out episode 26. Context matter in other ways for tones as well. So for example, if we have many third tones in a row, how they are grouped together and therefore changed depends on the rate of speech. If somebody speaks more slowly, fewer tone changes will occur compared to someone who speaks more rapidly. And this is something you could study the theory for, but it wouldn't take you that far, to be honest, and it's also quite complicated. Or you can just listen to lots of people saying this and study how they actually pronounce it. This is something that YouGlish makes quite easy to study, but if you're just using your textbook and a podcast or two, you might not notice. Another awesome aspect of YouGlish, or of YouTube in general, is that the variety of videos available is huge. Some of them are podcasts, some of them are discussions between 2, 3, 4 or more people, there are monologues, there are TV shows. There are different ways of people speaking Chinese and using their language in context, in real life. And hearing things pronounced in different contexts will make it easier for you then to also understand these words when you hear them, or indeed pronounce them, if that's what you're after. Finally, unlike the characters in your textbook, people in the real world speak with different accents and they have different speaking styles and voices and so on, and this is fairly well represented on YouTube, but not in your textbook. Sometimes you can also explore these differences more systematically, although this is not always reliable. For example, just because a clip is tagged as Taiwan, it doesn't mean that everybody in that clip will speak Taiwanese Mandarin, and there are indeed many different ways of speaking Taiwanese Mandarin. Also, it's worth noting that these tags are probably chosen based on some metadata and not an actual analysis of the pronunciation involved. Everything here is from YouTube after all and presented for free, so while this is a good way to get at the full diversity of the Chinese language used online, it doesn't mean that it is systematic or sorted by accent or anything like that. So to summarize, YouGlish is useful as a pronunciation reference because you can hear how words are pronounced in context by different people in real life. Not in your textbook and not your teachers speaking to you as a learner, but actually real people using this language to communicate with other speakers. The second way you can use YouGlish that we're going to talk about here is to understand how words are used in context. And now I'm not talking about the pronunciation, but rather their function in sentences and how they are combined with other words to form sentences. This is another drawback with most traditional learning materials, such as textbooks. They will typically only show you one example sentence, or maybe you can combine and get a few example sentences if you also include the text in the textbooks or different exercises and so on. But this is far from enough if you want to really learn how words are used. YouGlish is very helpful here because it allows you to browse through different usages of the same word or expression, and since you also have a transcript, you can quickly see how it's used and then play the clip if you find it interesting. You can think of YouGlish as being like a sentence bank or corpus, except that it is in video format, so you can both see the people saying it and hear how they say it, along with the transcript and see how it's written in pinyin and Chinese characters. So beyond using this to figure out basic grammar patterns and see how the words that you are learning fit into these grammar patterns, you can also use it for other grammar-related things, such as collocations. So, for example, which words go together with which other words. We all know that there are many words to learn in the Chinese language, but there are even more ways of combining these words, and when you have words that seem to mean roughly the same thing, so for example, if you look up the word increase, you will find words like 增长, 增强, 增大, and these seem fairly similar on the surface, but if you want to figure out which are used with which other words, I mean which things are increasing when you use 增长, and when can you use 增强, and so on. Things like this can be hard to look up, but you can use a corpus, or now you can also use YouGlish then to get an easy-to-access video version of different ways of using these words. Finally, I think it's also possible to pick up more nuanced patterns in how words are used if you listen to only that word occur in, a dozen different sentences or maybe a few dozen sentences, because you will notice how people use it, in what kind of context, and a lot of other things, and I will return to this a little bit later in this episode. So while I think that YouGlish is useful and kind of fun on its own, it works best if you combine it with what you're already doing, with other learning resources and with other learning methods. So let me share a few ideas of how to use YouGlish to improve your Mandarin. First, I think that YouGlish is maybe not the best resource to learn something completely new, but it is a great way to study something you've learned elsewhere, such as a textbook. You can also use YouGlish to reinforce other forms of learning, such as flashcards, and in theory you could also use the audio that you find on your flashcards, although that requires some kind of extra software and might be a bit finicky. Anyway, if you want more diversity in your input, you can use YouGlish to get perspectives on how things are used and pronounced. Next, I think you can use YouGlish to practice your pronunciation. This is no surprise. I mentioned how it can be used as a pronunciation reference, but you could also mimic what you hear or study how different people pronounce something, and maybe you can even find someone who pronounces Mandarin in a way that you also want to pronounce it, so you can use that for mimicking later. If you want to do that, I strongly suggest you check out episode 162, where I talk more about how to improve your Mandarin pronunciation through mimicking. And here I think it's much easier if you download the audio and then use it in an external program such as Audacity. Finally, I think YouGlish is great for exploring how words are used. So let's say you study a word and you know what it means, but you don't really know how real people use this word. And sometimes this is not at all apparent just based on the English definition. If you listen to episode 194, for example, which was about Chengyu, you will know that many definitions of Chengyu don't really tell you enough so that you can use these on your own, and the risk is that you will just use them incorrectly the first few dozen times until people correct you enough so you actually home in on the correct usage. Another alternative then is to input the Chengyu into YouGlish and see how people use it, study how they say it, and also in what contexts they use it, and what function it has in a sentence. So just to mention one example, we have the Chengyu 不知不觉, which means unwittingly or unconsciously, if you look it up in a dictionary. But this is not how it's actually used. I mean, it means that, but you need to know more about the usage to be able to actually use this accurately. As mentioned in that episode about Chengyu, this is usually used about time passing unwittingly or without you knowing it, which is not part of the definition, but which you will notice if you study all these examples. If you search for 不知不觉 in the Chinese version on YouGlish, you will find 107 instances of this Chengyu, and you can browse through all of them if you like, but I looked through about half of them and noticed some things that might be interesting to know as a student. For example, you can see that it's something that happens over time, which I just mentioned. You can also see that it's often followed by 中 or sometimes by 间, or sometimes it's used to modify a verb that comes immediately after. And then sometimes you have a de in between and sometimes you don't. So by using YouGlish to browse these examples, you can learn more about how expressions are used in the real world, and this is something, as I said, that is sorely lacking in most learning materials. So to wrap up this episode, I think YouGlish is a wonderful tool for looking up how Chinese is pronounced in context, and also how words are used in context and how they interact with other words. The interface makes it easy to hear the same word over and over in different clips and switch between these clips, go back, play again, change the tempo, and so on. The only drawback I can come up with is that it really doesn't work if you're a beginner, because most of the contexts in which the words you look up appear in will be too hard to understand or will take too long to decipher. But if you're an intermediate learner or up, this tool really is quite handy. I'm sure there are other clever ways of using YouGlish to study Mandarin, so if you have any ideas, please head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.